Raise your left hand if your biggest risk is that you can't build the product or service you plan to build. Raise your right hand if the biggest risk is that nobody will care once you do. And now raise your left hand if the thing you spend most of your time on is building your product or service, adding features, sitting around in scrums, talking about the roadmap, the Jira queue, and so on. Raise your right hand if what you spend most of your time on is creating attention you can turn into profitable demand. With that in mind, if you raise your left hand on the first and your right hand on the second question, you are not investing your time, and you need to unlearn everything you know about product and transfer that to go-to-market strategy.
Before we get started with the show, I wanted to offer you the chance potentially of a lifetime. If you're looking to get your brand in front of the boldest thinkers in business, this is the place to do it. The Unlearn podcast is downloaded in over 85 countries with a growing audience of over 100,000 listeners per month. That includes C-suite leaders, startup founders, and executives from Fortune 500 companies to scaling startups. We're ranked in the top 1% of business podcasts on Spotify and Apple across multiple regions. But our listeners just don't stream, they stick around, with 85% completing the entire show on their first listen. If your brand wants to align with bold ideas, breakthrough thinking, and a global audience that's not afraid to challenge the startup quo, get in touch. For the first time ever, we're offering sponsorship opportunities on the show, and we'd love to have you with us.
Enjoying the podcast? Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. This way, you won't miss any episode, and it greatly supports our podcast.
Today on Unlearn, I'm joined by someone who's been challenging the way we build businesses, products, and even our own visions of success, Alistair Croll. Alistair is a technologist, founder, and best-selling author. You probably know him as the co-author of Lean Analytics, the essential guide for using data to find product market fit. But Alistair doesn't stop at metrics. He goes after the hard questions about attention, ethics, and disruption. In his latest book, Just Evil Enough, written with Emily Ross, who's also been on the show, is a masterclass in subversive thinking. It's about how startups and even movements hack culture, earn attention, and spark change by being bold, weird, and yes, just evil enough to break through the noise. Alistair's career has spanned startup trenches, boardrooms, and global stages like O'Reilly, Forward Conference, and beyond. But I want to admire most his willingness to rethink everything, to include how to unlearn the assumptions that hold us back. This conversation is about experimentation, power, attention, and what really takes to stand out in the crowded world that we live in. So let's get started with Alistair.
I would say I had an incredibly supportive mother. My father died when he was pretty young. She took some of his royalties and bought me an old Apple II clone. So I started writing BBSs on that thing. So this idea as a teenager that I could build a thing and people would enter it and start acting in certain ways, and then how I built it changed how they behaved, fascinated me with this idea of technology and the intersection with human behavior. So I think I kind of planted a seed. And I would be remiss in saying, I mean, you mentioned the Lean series, but Tim O'Reilly has taken a huge chance on me, not just in publishing two of my books, Complete Web Monitoring and Lean Analytics, but also asking me to chair Strata, which was, for 10 years was the go-to data science conference where so much of the modern AI world came from. And we shut it down in 2020 when the pandemic hit, but that was a 10-year arc, 15,000 people, 5 cities. And it was an incredible opportunity to meet the smartest people in the world thinking about the hardest problems. And Tim always, and Laura and the whole team always supported us. We put speakers on stage that made the sponsors quake in their boots, who said important things about data science. We had a speaker talk about how big data is the new uranium, and once we made radium underpants, and I could just feel the entire sales team cringe, but they didn't ask that question. They were like, this needs to be discussed. So I would say my relationship with O'Reilly has been a hugely supportive thing for just working on interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, it's great. And probably one of the questions I got the most when Lean Enterprise came out was Tim O'Reilly my dad? That's probably the first question I got. And then the second question was, did they think I owned O'Reilly Publishing and I was just self-publishing? So I had the pleasure to meet Tim many times in San Francisco to validate he wasn't my dad, but it was pretty funny. I went to food camp one time and loads of his family were there, which is kind of this camp that he organizes in their offices in Northern California. And people saw my badge, again, Barry O'Reilly, and everyone was like, I've never seen you at the family barbecue.
That's the time to get in on the inheritance. I used to have people on airplanes ask me if O'Reilly Media produced Fox News because of Bill O'Reilly. That was the one they got confused by.
Yeah. Well, I think we're definitely more aligned to Tim than Bill, so that's always good. So tell us then a little bit about this book in particular, right? Like one of the fascinating things when I started to read the book, it's packed with like so many examples. I was generally like laughing out loud as I was reading the book at different stages, which is very interesting for what people would consider a business marketing human behavior book, and yet I'm just laughing the whole time. So what were some of the things as you sort of went into this space, especially with your background in data and analytics and human behavior, and then getting people to think about subversive marketing strategies? What sort of surprised you, if you will, that you had to unlearn as you sort of started to peel the layers back on this?
I think laughing out loud at case studies says more about you than the book. But Emily and I definitely wanted to make something. Emily asked me once a few years ago, what do you want this book to be? And I said, I want it to be something that can be taught in universities, but people still read on the beach. And that's a weird like needle to thread. A few weeks ago, I was guest lecturing at Stanford in a course on intro to product management with Teresa Johnson. She's a doctor who works there. She's now at Roblox, Airbnb, amazingly talented startup person. And a friend of mine sent me a photo of herself reading the book on the beach. So I was like, okay, that's good. And that definitely is the tone we wanted. I think subversive strategies are inherently funny because they're surprising. And it's the nature of human learning that we get pleasure from resolving what's called a benign knowledge gap. So when someone tells you a joke and you don't know the punchline and then they resolve the punchline, that's the feeling of learning, and your brain gives you a little juice of rewards, and that's pleasurable. And so I think what we loved about writing the book was revealing some of these things that are either obvious in hindsight or there's a hidden story behind what happened. And there's just so many of them. The reason that they work, not just from an entertainment perspective, but a business perspective, is because they're novel. Otherwise, you wouldn't laugh. They are generally counteracting or disagreeing with some widely held preconception. Otherwise, they wouldn't be subversive. And the people were audacious enough to do the thing that once they did it, everyone else went, well, of course that's what you should do. But nobody had done it beforehand. Like Coca-Cola invented the coupon in the early 1900s. And at the time, people were like, this is going to confuse inheritance law. This is going to be bad for the economy, right? It's a coupon. But somebody came up with the coupon, and that seems bland today. The modern companies that are doing well are all inventing the equivalent of the coupon. To your original question, I spent a lot of time talking to startups since Lean Analytics came out. I mean, that book went around the world. I got a message from a student in Madagascar that was using it in university. I didn't know there were business courses in Madagascar. I guess they are. And every time I see startups pitch, they tell me all about their features. They tell me all about what they're doing. They over-index on the things that are within their control. The font choice, the screen layout. They'll obsess over Figma and just one more feature. And yet, when you ask a room full of startups what it is that's riskiest, if you ask them to raise their hands, I mean, your listeners can do this. Don't take your hands off the steering wheel if you're driving, but raise your left hand if your biggest risk is that you can't build the product or service you plan to build. Raise your right hand if the biggest risk is that nobody will care once you do. And if you're honest with yourself, I would guess that 95% of drivers have their right hand off the wheel right now. And now, raise your left hand on the subway or bus that you're sitting on and have everyone look at you weirdly if the thing you spend most of your time on is building your product or service, little minutia, writing press releases, adding features, sitting around in scrums, talking about the roadmap, the Jira queue, and so on. Raise your right hand if what you spend most of your time on is capturing attention or creating attention you can turn into profitable demand. And most people on the subway have their right hand raised and everyone's looking at them funny. So with that in mind, if you raise your left hand on the first and your right hand on the second question, you are not investing your time, and you need to unlearn everything you know about product and transfer that to go-to-market strategy, because we have lots of books on product innovation. We have woefully few on go-to-market innovation. It's just that, go-to-market innovation is a much less fun title than Just Evil Enough.
Yeah, but it's a really important point, right? Like, I see this every day. I'm guilty of making these mistakes myself too, right? As you say, when you have an idea, it's easy to fall into the trap of creating the idea. But one of the things I really took away from reading the book, as you're sort of framing it here, is like creating the demand or finding out if there is the demand for it by using these counterintuitive strategies to like test demand, right? And as you say, like go to market is one of these things where it almost feels like it's in the production line world. We have the idea, we get the team, we get the money, we build the thing, and then we make money, right? It's like the underpants gnomes in South Park. It's like, have idea, something happens, profit, So tell us, like, because I think for what you alluded to this thing about Coca-Cola, again, tell us a few more of these great little examples about what companies did to sort of prove that out or create some of these.
I can tell you one I saw the other day, which was hilarious. I think Burger King are masters at this because they're an underdog. They are outmaneuvered and outspent by McDonald's, and they have to be creative. So they've done all kinds of funny things. They recently sponsored the lowest ranked team that would be in the FIFA video game, so they could have the Burger King logo on the t-shirts of the people in FIFA. And then they went to streamers and said, if you stream, like, you can pick the best players, but make them part of that team. And then if you stream with everybody wearing Burger King shirts, we'll give you money. Instant free advertising, right? They do stuff like this all the time. I mean, the Burger King home speaker one is legendary. Yeah, and you can go see the fingerprints of this. So when Google's home speaker came out, Burger King did a 15-second Super Bowl ad where they said, we don't have enough time to tell you what's in the Whopper, but I have an idea. And then this guy on screen goes, okay, Google, what's in a Whopper? And at this point, thousands of Google Home speakers woke up and started reading the Whopper description. But that's not the funny part. The funny part is the night before, someone had edited the Wikipedia entry to change what it was to something like, it's America's favorite burger. And if you go and look at that edit, the name of that person who was banned on Wikipedia is the CMO of Burger King. Like, he left his fingerprints, right? My favorite one of these, which is brilliant because it's not just funny, it's actually moving people forward, is they said, look, we are going to launch a mobile app. So what do you need when people have a mobile ordering app? Number one, you need installs. But to really move them through the funnel, you also need the enablement of GPS. You have to turn on location services on your phone, and you have to have a payment method. Like, once you have those things, it's very easy to open the app and order a burger. So what they did is they launched something called the Whopper Detour. And for about a week, you could buy a Whopper for 1 cent. The catch was you had to do it from a McDonald's parking lot. And so everybody loved this because they're trolling McDonald's, right? But at the same time, there's some deep business logic here that they're getting an install. You can't tell it you're at McDonald's at turning on location services, and you have to pay a penny, so I've got your credit card information. So that's like a genius thing where you're so busy thinking you're sticking it to the man and infuriating the local McDonald's franchise owner who wonders why people keep pulling up and leaving. But also, you're inadvertently doing the three things that move you down the funnel towards becoming a regular user. That's genius. And so I think it's thinking like that. What do I actually need to do? In this case, being aware that you don't just need installs, you need meaningful metrics like number of people who've installed, put in their payment information, turned on location services, and purchased one item. That's what you need, right? That's a properly converted user. And then number two, saying, what's the craziest legal thing I can do that people will find funny, that everyone will talk about, that produces that behavior? That's a classic example of creating attention and then turning it into profitable demand.
Yeah, no, they're like, this is one of the things as I was reading through the book, I just, the examples just kept turning all these light bulbs on, right? But again, as you're sort of breaking it down here, You know, there's real systematic thought in what's going on, right? Like people are going through, as you've just described, this converting them to a funnel, the hardest things, the install, the usage, and credit card information and a purchase, right? So you get this slice, if you will, like through the customer journey that you're aiming for, right? So I know you've been talking a lot about this even after the book started to come out. But one of the things that really interested me that you mentioned when we were talking just before the show was this idea that people sort of have these limiting almost beliefs or this fear of I won't be able to do something. And I think this is really, really important in the idea of a new product or a new technology. I think actually examples of this are I see in a daily life where you talk to people about trying to use automation or AI tools in their daily work. It feels scary, so they'll just stick using the same old typewriter to do everything, right? Never mind run a spell check on anything. So talk to us about how you've labeled that actual experience, why people sort of go through it, and then what can be sort of, if you will, like a mitigation for it.
For sure. And I'll give you an example at the end of this from a talk I'm giving on AI for a digital government conference I run, because I think there's a very good sort of 2x2 framework people can use to unstick themselves here. But I think what you're referring to is this idea we call the long funnel. So about 100 years ago, marketing people used to use this thing called the AIDA model. AIDA means attention, information, desire, action. And it's basically something captures your attention, some kind of stimulus. You get information. In some cases, they talk about interest instead of information that produces a desire. And the desire is the result of a gap between what you have and what you could have. And then you act to resolve that gap. We like to take a longer view of that, or a more detailed view of that. I mean, obviously you have multiple stakeholders if you're running a conference, you have sponsors and you have the media and you have ticket buyers and so on. And each of those people have different actions. You might want a sponsor to sponsor your conference by giving you money, but also take the stage to speak. You might want the media to attend and write about it, right? But the problem comes about because, first of all, our brains are firewalls. We are inundated with information. Most of the information you hear, you ignore completely. In fact, if I'm talking like this and people are in a car or listening to the AirPods, they're probably tuning out some of the words. But if I stop, stop for an awkward amount of time, everybody suddenly started paying attention, right? You were wondering if people were going to cancel the podcast or look at their phones. I have their attention. So that's an example of an objective way of getting stimulus past it. Our brains are tuned to listen for novelty. That's a stimulus, kind of objective stimulus. Bright lights, something tapping on you, SMS, because that's the mechanism that only your friends have. Those are things that will be objectively seen as more relevant. Then there's this idea of collective relevance. What are my friends talking about? If I talk about this thing, will they shun me or will they be interested? And then there's subjective relevance. Is this message aimed at me? And that can be stuff like it has my name, but also more specific stuff like, does it feel like it's for me? How am I going to interpret it? If you send a weight loss ad to a person who is overweight versus underweight, that's going to hit differently for them. So the relevance is super important. If you don't get the message relevant, it won't even be considered because it won't bypass the brain's firewalls. Later on, I think what you were referring to is this idea of objections. So objections come in two forms. There's objections that are like, hey, I can't afford this. It's a valid objection. The customer's aware of it. They probably state it. And you can mitigate it by being aware of what their concern is and providing a solution. So we offer financing, for example. But what's more interesting and less commonly discussed is fluency. Unlike a known obstacle, fluency is about whether the stakeholder can see themselves acting. It's self-perception. Can you do what's asked? Right? And a lot of people might not see themselves acting because their fluency affects their behavior, but they're less likely to say something about it. So there's a big difference between I desire this thing and I can see myself satisfying this thing. That's a huge difference. Most people would love a thing, but they can't see themselves doing it. I'd love a tropical trip, but I can't afford it. That's a valid objection. I would love to go rock climbing, but I can't see myself doing it. Well, we have lessons and lots of people like you and at your age start doing it. And, so I can appeal to that. And so we talk about this thing called the fluency equation. So the fluency equation is, and this is not real math, but the fluency equation says that on the top of the equation is desire. And then desire is divided by, again, not math, inexperience, complexity, and consequence. So everybody spends their time making the thing desirable. That's great. Well done. Keep doing it. Everybody's doing that. But it doesn't help you stand out. Inexperience is, does the person know what they're doing? Like, do they feel like they're able to do this? Complexity is, how complicated is the thing you're asking them to do? How complicated does it seem? And the consequences are, what happens if they're wrong? And so I think people don't spend enough time in their go-to-market strategy convincing the prospect that they are fluent in the action you're asking them to take.
Yeah, well, this is really top of mind for me at the moment, right? So one of the things I did probably only like 3 weeks ago is I sent a survey to about 5,000 execs, right?
Yeah, I read it this morning. It was great.
Yeah, right. So asking them these questions on, what do you think are your biggest needs with learning how to use AI to be more productive as a leader? And again, as you're describing this sort of framework and thinking, so much of what I felt like I heard back in their survey was this idea that, yes, there's a massive desire. Like 92% of people said they believe that these tools will make them more effective, right? And then when I asked them, well, how many of you feel like you're using these tools? 4% of them were like, oh yeah, I'm using them. I think it was in the region of like 56 or 57 consider themselves a beginner. So there's this huge gap between this stated desire, if you will, in what you're describing, and then the ability to start, right? And they can see all these promises that this tool could offer them.
The irony here, of course, is that this is the first tool we've ever made that is its own user manual. Like, there's no barrier to entry. You just start talking. And so, like, all of the normal excuses are gone. You can literally say, how should I use you? And it will start asking you questions. In this case, there is no obstacle. It is free. If you have a device and can speak, you can start using it. So it's an unusual use case because the obstacle is zero. It's just a matter of talking to it, but it's the fluency that's holding people back for sure.
And that's what's really fascinating to me when you're describing it, right? Is I don't know, is it a fear? Is it just the unknown? Is it the sense that it's too complex, right? And for someone like obviously yourself who's been in this world for 10 plus years, you've learned this sort of, that the way to get started is actually, it's not as complicated as you think. Like the process, it's uncomfortable, but the process of understanding this is just start doing it.
You could just do stuff. I think this is the problem the current entire generation coming into the workforce has. We are paralyzed with the number of things we could do. And so the people that stand out are those who actually find the outcome. We've never had a time in human history where you can go and look at videos on how to do things and had a chatbot tell you how to do it and like make you interactive stuff. You can just do stuff. And because of the land grab that's going on in AI right now, it won't always be free. But right now, these things are free for a basic use case. They're free to play with. There are no excuses. Roughly 5.5 billion humans have access to these tools for free. That is unprecedented. And so I think if you want to break down the formula first, let's talk about the three problems. So the first one is like inexperience, right? Inexperience, the way you resolve that is you make the thing look familiar and similar to something they've already done. You use words like as easy as, people everywhere are, or if you X, you can Y. So for example, after a meeting, you write up a message and send it out to the group email or post it on Slack. Open up a second tab and paste that information into ChatGPT or Claude or Grok or whatever tool, Gemini, whatever you're using, and just start doing that. That's all. That's it. So very low ask, adds on to a behavior you're already doing, right? And maybe even say other executives who've done this have found themselves 20% more thoughtful in their outcomes, right?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So pick an existing habit and then anchor onto that habit. Something you're already doing, it's only a little more work. At the end of your day, when you're in the elevator, open up the thing, press the microphone button, and talk for 3 minutes about what you did that day, like journaling. Okay, so come up with a very basic thing that says you can just totally do this thing. The second thing is complexity. A lot of people provide too much information. In the blitz scaling thing, they say, if you aren't ashamed of your product when you launch, you waited too long. Emily and I say, if you aren't worried about what you left out of your message, it's too complicated. And so offer fewer options than you thought you needed to. Make default decisions for people. A great example of like Notion did this, right? Notion just went, here's a bunch of templates. You want to edit it, click edit. Okay, now you're a user. Oh, look, I actually installed the funnel by giving you a template. There were so few options. And I think this, as opposed to, here's a blank white screen, please start editing, right? Which would have been a disaster to try and sell. So offering few options. I love this example. It's in the book. During COVID, there was an explosion of online food options. And we went from how do I order food to I got 15 different options for spaghetti. I have no idea what to do. And so people got such complexity. Cloud Kitchens came up with names for restaurants like, and I'm going to quote, fucking good pizza, pimp my pasta, dirty little vegan, and bitch don't grill my cheese. What they were doing is they were switching your mental model for choosing what to order from food complexity to which of these titles is catchy and makes me laugh.
Yeah, yeah.
So they gave the buyer a less complex decision-making system. Seems stupid, worked pretty well. And then the third thing is the consequence, right? Reducing the perceived risk. And I'll go back way in history because as you know from the book, we go to like prehistory all the way to modern day. Everybody knows about James Watt choosing the word horsepower to give people an easy analogy for the work done by steam engines. What fewer people know is that Watt's real genius and his business partner's real genius was they didn't sell steam engines. Before James Watt's steam engine was the Newcomen atmospheric engine. It was a single boiler, and it basically pressurized steam, pushed a piston up, and then gradually the piston came back down as things cooled. Very inefficient. James Watt developed a thing that had two pistons, and they had condensers, so it pushed and it sucked the piston back down, made it 4 times as efficient. So Watt said to people, listen, I'm going to charge you a little tiny bit for some intricate gearing, and I'll give you the plans for the rest of the stuff. They didn't even sell the whole engine. And you're going to pay me part of your savings versus the Newcomen atmospheric engine. That's a great way to reduce the perceived cost, right? He changed the billing model so there's much less risk because you weren't spending up front. So doing those 3 things, convincing people that they can do it by attaching it to something familiar they've already done, that their peers are already doing, reduces the perceived inexperience. Simplifying it so there's less complexity. And then giving people a low consequence risk removal. Those 3 things increase fluency. And I think that's where if you're trying to get behavioral change to happen. Now, I did say I'm going to give you one other quick idea. I think that if I'm an executive talking about AI adoption, I like to draw a 2x2 matrix because all consultants like 2x2 matrices, right?
Yeah, he does.
On the left, I want you to put one-way doors and two-way doors. So a two-way door, as you know from Amazon, is a decision you can make and then you can undo pretty easily. And then I want you on the bottom to write testable, untestable. So if something is a one-way door that's untestable, you probably shouldn't start there because you can't run experiments to find out if it's going to work. And once you do it, you're toast. If something is a two-way door and it's easy to test, great, do that. Just do all those things. If something's a two-way door, but it's untestable, then before you go ahead, work out the plan for how you will back out if and when it fails. If something is a one-way door, but testable, spend all your time on testing and documenting edge cases and doing evals and so on to make sure it works. And very quickly, if you set things into those 2 terms, you'll understand whether it's something you can just try, something you should wait for others to screw up, something that you should focus on experimentation and QA, or something you should focus on rollback. That's a very easy way to think about any sort of existential technology. The real risk is not doing the stuff in the two-way door testable thing, because then you're just going to fall behind.
I think this is one of the things that's always fascinating to me is the biggest risk is doing nothing.
Tim O'Reilly says this. He says, why do we need to write a document to tell you how the product's going to change, but not a document to justify why we aren't changing it?
Yeah, it's frightening. Thinking more then about these go-to-market strategies that you've helped people with, right? Like these are great tools that you're giving people and examples. What is something you feel in the industry then that radically needs to change or be unlearned about how people are doing this? Because I still feel like your classic go-to-market play is somewhere somebody draws a prototype persona in the product development process that's, you know, generally Bob, who lives in, you know, here, who's 25 to 35, this sort of very generic sort of demographic information, and they magically have the problem that you've invented for the solution that you've created, right? And then then we go buy Facebook ads, and then everybody gets rich yet again, right? So
yeah, I mean, first of all, what you're describing is product market fit, but it's product market fit that's disingenuous. Like that's the lying to yourself product market fit. I can make any product fit a market if I get to define the market narrowly enough. One of our hot takes in the book is that there's product, there's market, and there's medium fit. And especially in the modern world, the medium is so much more important. We used to think of the medium as an afterthought. Like once I've got the product, I'll do some advertising. What are you going to do? I don't know. We'll decide later. We'll do an ad buy. We'll get some newspaper ads. Today, the medium in many products is how your customer finds you. It's how your customer tests you. It's how your customer pays for you. It's how they download and use the product. It's how they complain to you and get support. Like the medium is a huge part of this. But more importantly, if the biggest risk is can you capture attention? If you know that's the biggest risk, then start by capturing attention. Like, how do you do that? Well, I years ago, I spoke at a conference, another lean conference called Lean UX. And they called me up and they're like, hey, you want to speak at our conference? I said, sure. A book just came out. What are you paying? They said, we'll pay you a bottle of scotch. Side note, pay your speakers. And then they said, oh, we'll pay for your plane flight and stuff. And they seem like nice people. So I flew to New York. And they told me how they did this. They said, we wanted to do everything according to the lean startup model. So we said to ourselves, if we can write a newsletter and get 1,000 subscribers, then we will ask if there's demand for a conference. If we can get 300 people to say they will pay $500 to go to a conference within a 3-week period, within 25 miles of New York, then we will reach out to speakers, which is where I came in. Then they said, okay, if we can get speakers to confirm that they'll do it for this amount of money, we will then sell tickets to people and confirm the date, and then we'll book a venue. The first thing a normal conference does is book a venue and find speakers and then hope they can sell some, right?
Yeah,
so
they go the opposite direction.
Right. So they completely reversed it. So I think the thing to do is list all of the tasks that need to happen and then filter them by which ones you have the least control over. People need to unlearn the traditional build, then market, then grow the demand. Because in a world where demand is the real question, and honestly, with AI and vibe coding and cloud computing and social media, all those things that used to be important and expensive, buying hardware, buying advertising and marketing, hiring lots of developers to do things, those things, we've seen a complete reversal in where the risk of business is. It's no longer the construction of the product or service, but rather the validation of meaningful demand. And until the companies, big and small, reverse things completely, there's always going to be a disconnect there. I think that's the core idea of the book.
Yeah, and I just think it's actually a really seminal message for people both listening to the show today and to start thinking about too as well, is the construction era. You know, it's like we've ended the industrial era in software now, where the cost of the production was so high that naturally people sort of just almost gravitated their focus, their energy. The budget that they were securing was to pay for people to sit on seats and type and design and create. And in many ways, these new tools have sort of reduced that cost by, orders of magnitude.
Well, I'm writing a post for Startupfest, this conference that I run in July in Montreal. Come to Montreal, everybody. And it's called the Fourth Miscapitalization, because I think there was a huge miscapitalization. I was guilty of this. We bought a lot of hardware and then cloud computing came along. There was another miscapitalization when we moved from client server to SaaS, because client server was all about one build a year, ship it out on disks, and then have no idea what your customers are doing. And if you didn't move to the SaaS model, everything changed. And companies capitalized themselves to support a software distribution methodology. There was a huge amount of money invested in the QA cycles and the minting of gold masters and distribution and all that stuff. That was unnecessary. Then there was a huge capital investment for the hardware infrastructure, and Coradiant, the MSP that I started, did this. And then, we diluted ourselves in the first round because we needed hardware. And then following that, the miscapitalization, I think, was the social media platforms where all of your marketing budgets didn't matter anymore. You could now have good content marketing and email and so on. And if you were hiring this traditional marketing trade show team, it was kind of like, okay, not so sure that works. We're in the fourth miscapitalization, which is engineering miscapitalization, where you're over-indexing on the bodies to build the software in a world where you're going to prototype very quickly, and then you're going to be able to fund your growth with early adoption much faster. And so any companies that are capitalized for heavy developers, I talked to a guy who was building a clone of Otter, the Otter.ai. And Otter is a feature in search of a product, right? They record meetings, but that's now built into most tools. But more tellingly, they'd closed tens of millions of dollars. And this guy was cloning what they did for $500K. Like his marketing was, Otter owes VCs $70 million. My product's also cheaper and does the same thing. Would you like one? Like, that's a hard thing to say no to. And so I think that you're going to see attacks like that on incumbents that are miscapitalized for the AI era. And it's one of the reasons that big tech companies are doing what they're doing, is with laying people off. Obviously, there'll be new jobs with evals and integration and all that kind of stuff. But we're going through the fourth miscapitalization of the tech industry.
Yeah, and it's fascinating ultimately, because I think, again, as you're describing here, the key is like, can you identify demand? And if you have these counterintuitive strategies to differentiate yourself and then capture that demand, then, the execution of the building and the scaling and, that for me is the real magic then, where our ability to experiment, to come up with these creative, interesting ways to garner attention and actually connect with the people who might have these problems we believe they have. That's what gets me most excited, right? Because that is a realm of continuous experimentation and creativity. And it's one thing we've saw in our venture studio too as well. We have lived that problem you've described, where you're only one platform release away from businesses that you've spent months, hundreds of dollars on, people's hours trying to build. That's a platform release on one of these tools that you mentioned before, right?
Yeah, I think distribution and legitimacy are pretty much the only real marketing moats right now.
It's amazing, So while people are sitting there now panicking, going, we just took 50 million in the product that we've been building, and
they should put their hand down too. They're probably sitting there with their arm in the air on the subway. I should tell them to put their hands down. Yeah,
it's okay. It's all right. There's many people doing it. What are then some of the ways they can get started with this? Because I think this ability to really focus in on understanding and identifying demand is really the next huge skill that needs to be mastered for whether you're building products, whether you're trying to get anyone be part of any movement or service that you might want to build. What are some of the tips you have for people as to how they can start?
Well, the first thing they should do is go and listen to your interview with my co-author, Emily Ross, because she already talks about quite a lot of this stuff. And she's far more funny and articulate than I am, and Irish like you. So the two of you are a good crack, I think you say.
Harder for people to get two
Irish
Irish people.
No, Emily, yeah, exactly. Her accent did actually change. She's got more Irish accent when she talks to you. But that's a good one to listen to, so maybe post that link in here too. Yes, folks, you get a twofer of Alistair and Emily. I will say that we talk about this subversive mindset. Being aware of the system you're in is not just a good skill for marketing, it's a good life skill. Recognizing you're part of these systems. And I have a whole riff on how every American speaks two languages that I'm not going to bore you with now. But bottom line is understanding the systems you're in that are often unseen and unspoken. And you can find those many times by looking at who the system marginalizes. It's the person that is not benefiting from the system that's aware of it. If you're part of a system you benefit from, then you do just fine. And then figuring out, because of that system, How do you get it to behave in an unintended way, in a way that the creators of the system didn't want you to or didn't design it for? Some people call these hacks, right? Like when I'm in a hotel and I have work to do, I use the ironing board as a work desk because hotel desks are often a bad height. And if you're going to be typing for a few hours, you need something where your elbows are properly positioned. And so I use an ironing board. That's a hack, right? That's like using an ironing board for a thing for which it wasn't intended that actually gives me an advantage. So having that kind of mindset, always be looking for the unintended use case that gives you an unfair advantage, and then being willing to try that. I think my friend David McCraney says that, or I think he quotes someone in his book, How Minds Change, that humans are more afraid of social death than real death. We are so worried about what people will think of us, what will happen. Just do stuff. Like, honestly, people are so concerned and consumed with what others think. You know what others will think is great? When you do stuff. Like, just stop it. Do a thing. Rip the Band-Aid off. Eat the frog. Say the quiet part out loud. There's a term for this. It's called disagreeability. And Emily and I argued a lot about this because it's very easy for me as a loud, straight white dude to say, go be disagreeable. But there's lots of people who are keeping their heads down just to keep their jobs. So what we mean by disagreeability is be willing to act where others won't or can't when it comes to your product or service. We're not saying go around being a jerk. We're saying have a disagreement with the world. Like if you're a startup and you can't tell me what your big disagreement with the world is, you probably aren't a startup. You're probably in the status quo. So like spend a lot of time figuring out what you disagree with in the world and then make that the reason you exist. It can be a good disagreement. Don't be contrarian for the sake of being contrarian. But if you haven't figured out what your big disagreement with the world is, probably should get that figured out before you do anything else.
It's so funny as you share all these things, you get me thinking about these questions to help teams, right? And so many of them are just getting people to think from the different perspective. I always think Chris Voss, when he wrote Never Split the Difference, one of my favorite exact hacks, if you will, in that is rather than getting people to agree with you, is get them to explain why they think it isn't a good idea.
Yeah.
Tell me what's wrong. What am I getting wrong here? What do I think is good that you think is actually incorrect? And people feel much more comfortable then when they're not saying no to you. They feel like they're telling you ways to improve the thing.
They feel like they're helping you, yeah.
Exactly, right? And the truth is they are, right? They're helping you by giving you the obstacles, these, if you will, to your earlier points of the friction points that are holding them back from going through to this desired place that you want them to go to. Maybe they want to go, but it costs too much. I don't have the time to do it. It's a complex tool where I don't know where to start. It's my team's responsibility.
And I think it's really important to mention, like, when you say, I don't have the time to do it, it's very easy to be too evil. We have a whole chapter in the book devoted to not actually being evil. Like, don't assume consent. I could overcome the I don't have time by just doing it for you and going, here's your account. It's all set up. You've been logged in. And by the way, I've already charged your credit card. Don't do that. A large part of the book is devoted to this idea of things that are too evil. And there's a bunch of reasons, but I think one of the most evil things is just to assume consent. Yes, people are busy. Yes, you don't have people's attention, but you have to respect the boundaries they have and what's actually good for them. Ultimately, one of the tactics in the book is bait and switch. Bait and switch, if you don't actually give people what you said, is called fraud, right? So don't be fraudulent, right? So it's very easy to stumble across the line of too evil. And we try to draw a pretty clear line there. But what you're trying to do, as you say, is remove the obstacles between between your target market and the outcome you want, but you still have this assumption that the thing you're selling is useful to the target customer, right? Otherwise, it's a scam.
It's always super fun to chat. This is, again, I can't recommend the book enough to people. It's summertime while this podcast is coming out. So yes, read it on the beach, read it on the train. I guarantee you will be laughing and learning. And I just think that's a great place to be with any new thing that you sort of expose yourself to. Alistair, it's always fun to have you on the show. It was amazing to have Emily on the show. We'll make sure everything is in the show notes so people can follow up, learn more. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
Thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode useful, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please consider leaving a rating or a review, as it helps others find our podcast. For more episode and details about the show, visit barryoreilly.com, and we'll see you on the next episode.